Plant nutrients. We're going to talk about those for today's lecture, and I wanted to start out by uh, going over the definition of soil once again and all the things that are involved in soil, the different components. We have inorganic mineral particles like sand, silt, and clay that determine texture, rocks. What else would be in there that's inorganic? We could include water and air at the bottom of your list. Those are not organic. Organic in this context just means derived from biological organisms. But then you have organic matter that comes from biological organisms or living things. It's not living anymore, but that's where it comes directly from. Like leaf litter. Litter just means like leaves and sticks and things kind of lying on the ground. Animal droppings and animal body remains. And when we say that, remember that includes all types of things, not just gophers and snakes and birds, but also other types of animals, all the insects that live in the ground, and then also non-animal, remains like bacteria and protozoa. There's just billions of them, and they provide a lot of organic matter to the soil as well. And then the soil organisms themselves, while they're alive. So those are the 5 basic ingredients of soil. Let's look closely at carcasses and droppings, how important the nutrient cycles are in soil. So living things contain organic matter. It doesn't become organic matter in the soil until it's dead. But when they do die, a leaf falls off or a ladybug dies, they decompose. And then when they're in that decomposition process, the minerals and nutrients that are in the bodies of those organisms are freed up again to go into the soil, go into solution in the soil, and potentially be absorbed back up by a plant. So plant roots absorb those minerals from the soil. The minerals are incorporated into the plant, and then if an animal eats the plant, then they're incorporated into the animal body. And that's the whole cycle. Then the animal body dies and it repeats itself. So that's the nutrient cycle. You kind of already knew this, but just wanted to spell it out. Again, compost, when you're doing composting, it is a process where we speed up and we replicate the situation and that creates decomposition, and we speed it up to decompose plant bodies, dead plants, and release the minerals in them for new plants to take up. So let's look at the list of minerals and plant nutrients that are utilized. Macronutrients, macro meaning they are used in large amounts, and micronutrients. So on the left, you've got the list of macronutrients, and I have in parentheses if the source of them is not from the soil, like carbon. The carbon source is usually from the atmosphere for plants. They take in carbon from the atmosphere through their stomata into the interior of the plant. Hydrogen comes from water, from the roots of the soil. Oxygen comes from the air as well. So those things, those top 3, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, we don't really worry about those with plants. We don't really worry about those as plant, caregivers, people that take care of plants. They're already abundant. We don't have to try to give them more oxygen. Of course, we have to water them, but we don't worry about carbon dioxide and oxygen. So the last 6, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, those are 6 macronutrients that are needed by plants. They need to get those from the soil, and in many cases, the soil does not have the appropriate amounts for the plant, so we have to add those via a fertilizer. On the very bottom of that first column, you'll see an acronym for remembering the macronutrients. It's SHNOPS, CalMag, POT. Someone taught me this when I was an undergraduate student at Davis, and just a way to remember those. The C is for carbon, H, hydrogen, N, nitrogen, O, oxygen, P, phosphorus, S, sulfur, Cal, calcium, Mag, magnesium, and Pot, potassium. On the right-hand column are the micronutrients. These are all derived from the soil by the plant. That's where the plant gets them. Chlorine, iron, manganese, copper, sometimes cobalt is included, zinc, molybdenum, and boron. Now, a few years ago, my students came up with this acronym Shimborzico as a way to remember just the first letter or two of all of those micronutrients. So all of these nutrients are necessary for a plant's survival. They cannot continue to live for long periods of time without all of these. If there is something missing, even a micronutrient, which is just needed in small trace amounts, if that's missing, the plant will eventually get diseased and die. So they're all necessary, but the macronutrients are needed in higher quantities, much higher. It's kind of like iron for humans. If we only need a little amount of iron, but if we don't get that, we're not looking too good. Here's that list again, categorizing them in a different way. Macronutrients from the air, carbon dioxide or carbon and oxygen, and then macronutrients from the soil, water. There are primary macronutrients, NPK, and that the reason they're called primary is they're used in the highest amounts, and they're the ones that the fertilizers in agriculture focus on. Secondary macronutrients, calcium, sulfur, and magnesium, and then sometimes silicon is also included in the macronutrient list. And then the micronutrients are listed also. So just another way to categorize all those nutrients and think about them. Macronutrients, as I said, are consumed in larger quantities. So if you took a leaf and you took all the water out, which is about 96%, about 0.2 to 4% of that leaf dry weight would be macronutrients, those that were just mentioned. And if you took that same leaf, dried, took all the water out, only the remaining portion would be only 0.02% would be the part that is from micronutrients. So there's much less weight and mass from the micronutrients, but still needed. Next few slides show some of the functions and mobility of these nutrients. So let's take, for example, primary macronutrients. So these charts show you the macronutrient in the left column, the name of it, the symbol, and then the mobility, and then the function or role inside the plant. The mobility means if it can be moved around by the plant itself. Say the nitrogen comes in through the roots and is built into the protein of the leaf. If nitrogen is needed somewhere else in the plant and it can't get any more from the soil, can that plant move it from the leaf to where it's needed? And the answer is yes. And the role of the nitrogen in the plant is formation of amino acids, vitamins, and proteins, and cell division. All three of these, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are mobile. The plant can move them from one place to another to the place of highest demand within the plant. And that's important when it comes to diagnosing plant diseases. And if you see a nitrogen deficiency, you'll see it first in the oldest part of the plant, because the plant will always take the nutrients and try to give them to the newest, the youngest, currently growing part of the plant. Just like a human female, when they're pregnant, the nutrients will go to the baby, even if the mother is lacking in them, it doesn't have enough. It'll still take it from the mother's body, and the primary target is to make sure that that growing baby gets what it needs. Same with a plant. The target is to make sure the growing tips, the new leaves, the new stems, the flowers get what they need, even at the detriment to the older parts. But you'd see a nitrogen deficient plant could look like the leaves will start to yellow, but you would see the yellowing in the older leaves because the nitrogen has been moved out of them to the younger part. 3 more macronutrients: calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Calcium is not mobile, magnesium is, sulfur is not, and you see listed there various functions in the plant. just kind of for fun, I want to show you a list of micronutrients and tell you a little bit about how they function. That's actually not the fun part. I'm getting to that. But boron, chlorine, copper, iron, they have different functions. Some are mobile, some aren't. For the purposes of this class, I mainly want you to study and understand that micronutrients, know the different micronutrients, and that they're needed in trace amounts, and memorize a couple of their functions. Let's just compare this. This is what I think is fun. It's what, horticulture teachers that are slightly geeky think is fun. But look at the comparison of human hemoglobin, a very important molecule in the animals and human bodies, and plant chlorophyll, the analog to hemoglobin in a plant, the most important molecule to a plant, arguably. And they have the exact same, almost the exact same structure, except iron is the center of the human hemoglobin molecule, and magnesium is the center of the plant chlorophyll molecule. So if you notice kind of these little dangling tails off of both of those molecules, the left tail on hemoglobin just has an OH on the very end, the bottom part. And if you look over at chlorophyll, it actually has an OC. So it has and it says 20. That means there's a 20 carbon chain that hangs down further there that you don't see. So there's a pretty big difference there. But the head, the main structure of the molecule, is identical. So I don't know, just kind of neat that we have some similarities there, except for that micronutrient that's in the center. So actually this is a macronutrient in the plant's case and micronutrient in the animal's case with iron. But magnesium is still very important, and you can see why. It doesn't need a lot of it. It's a macronutrient, but it doesn't need a lot of it, of magnesium, but without that it would not be able to form chlorophyll. And if you didn't know that, you probably do, that chlorophyll is the molecule that is the main molecule involved in photosynthesis. The sun's light hits this molecule, excites it, and some of the electrons from the chlorophyll molecule are released and put into something called photosystems or electron transport chains. There's a series of enzymes and proteins that take the electrons and utilize them and then spit them out to the next protein. And as they keep going down the line, those electrons, they're able to create energy and store energy in the form of ATP. But that's getting more detailed than I really wanted to for this class, but just in case you wanted to know. Here's that first list of micronutrients, and the second list with manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and zinc. Like I said, we were not going to focus too much on their individual functions. And back to what we were talking about with nutrient mobility, this kind of reiterates what I was saying. Once inside the plants, the nutrients go where they're needed and become part of a tissue, but an immobile element or nutrient gets locked in place. It can't be moved by the plant. Those are the non-mobile nutrients. But a mobile nutrient can be taken out of that tissue and remobilized and moved to an area of greater demand. And we talked about how might mobility of nutrients help in deficiency diagnosis. It helps you know to look at, if it's a mobile nutrient, you'll see that deficiency symptom, if it's a yellowing of the leaf or drying out, something that shows nutrient deficiency would show up in the older leaves first, because all the nutrients are going to the new leaves. And if it doesn't have that pattern, if you see the yellowing in the new leaves, then you can pretty much be sure it's not a mobile nutrient.